The whole take it to shreds thing, that kind of scares me. But thank you for that. Hi, everybody. How are you doing today? Good? Good, good. Okay, we're awake. It's only 25 minutes long, so I guess we can stay awake that long, hopefully. But I'm here to talk to you about a quest for what I'm calling the quest for standards-based API security. I'll explain what I mean by that, but first maybe a quick introduction. So my name is Michele Leroux Bustamante, and I am a consultant. I have a company called Solliance that I co-founded. What we do is assemble teams for customers on the fly with levels of experts across our partner distribution. And that means bringing in people across the various clouds, bringing in people across the various identity solutions, bringing in people for big data and other types of, distributed and cloud-based usually applications. So that's what we do. I've been in, the sort of distributed system, identity, and cloud space for a really long time. So I do a lot of different things. A lot of what I try to do is stay pragmatic, only because sometimes the things we wish we could do, we don't always get to implement quite that way, because when you go to customers, they need something done in a customized way, or they have a special concern or situation. And I find that sometimes hits us as well when we deal with designing architectures around not only identity, but other types of standards. So I want to talk a little bit about the aspects of API security that I run into, obviously, from a high level, given the, quickness of this discussion. I want to talk about the protocol flows that I most usually run into in the context of that discussion. And I want to talk about, just in general, what that has meant to me and what it might mean to you in terms of selecting platforms that you might implement for such an architecture. And maybe that will open the door for some just open conversation after the fact. So with that, I think it's without saying, right? We have a lot of places that we possibly use APIs. We have web applications that we distribute that probably have JavaScript calling back to APIs, possibly co-hosted, right, with our web app. Very common scenario. We also have potentially some APIs that are hosted on either the same domain, but possibly a different subdomain, which means we are still dealing with potential for opening up for chorus calls from a JavaScript client. We also have third-party APIs that we may choose to integrate as part of that JavaScript client, because we need to access blobs from blob storage from somewhere, or some other URL that doesn't match our domain, or it could be just services that we want to pull in and we'd rather not have a secondary hop. So this is another common scenario. Then we may have in our ecosystem the apps we're building, these mobile applications that we develop that also need their own set of APIs. And usually what I find is it's better to put its own shim in front of that, right? Some sort of interface that maybe is slightly different and modeled for the mobile app, less chatty perhaps, returning different forms of the data than I might do from a web application. So I'm usually potentially accessing the same backend from there, but I'm definitely structuring the API for that and tailoring it for that, which means I can also look at how would I secure for that potentially in a different way too. And then we've got potentially APIs that we expose to third parties. So this is where we build out our ecosystem and reach other channels of marketing perhaps, because I've got all kinds of good data back here and you want to pay me for that so that you can access APIs and build your own UIs, applications, mobile apps, that kind of thing. That's not the only place that an API gateway fits. I know you've had probably some talks about that during this conference already. But it is a very common place where people will first think of it, right? Where I want to meter things, I want to control licensing, I want to, have different types of metrics, if you will, on the usage patterns, as opposed to the kinds of things that I might do behind the apps I build. So I'm really trying to separate the concept between, if you've got the message already, apps you build versus apps that we sort of, correlate into this ecosystem of apps. And so I'll continue that thread. Now, on the back of these APIs that might be facing the front end, facing the internet, we also have back-end APIs for sure. There's a couple of reasons why those might exist. Some of it might be just reuse, because I'm also calling those from back-end server processes. Maybe they're async processes, maybe they're jobs that run, and scale out compute cycles to do work. But there's some common, functionality between those and the things we offer to the front end. And there might be some other reasons we'd talk about separating that layer, but I'll get to that. So the point being, we have APIs in lots of places. We have some that we own, some that we don't, and we have some that we might expose to third parties and some that we just build into our ecosystem of applications, right? Okay. And then at some point, to access these things, we need credentials. Sometimes that starts with a user login to the web browser that would then turn into possibly access tokens that we use throughout the app tiers. Sometimes that might be mobile app, similar login, something that we might do and then get an access token. So we want to talk about how we traverse this set of, function calls, if you will, across those APIs from user login or not to getting access tokens to get to the APIs. Now, I said I would talk about API security holistically, and I think just to make sure that we're kind of completing the circle, when I work with customers and we talk about, how do we protect our system, usually that implies that I'm going to pull together a set of controls that I have to satisfy. And those controls traverse a lot of things, the high level of which would be with any system that I deploy, I have to have the confidentiality, which means obviously transfer security, which would be a TLS-based approach usually. In the old days, we might have talked about that as a WS trust transfer with SOAP-based services. And now we can do that, generally speaking, over HTTPS with bearer tokens, so we don't necessarily deal with the complexities of proof of possession tokens and so on. But the point being, we definitely want the channel to be secure, and then sometimes we also add security on top of that channel. I find that in healthcare, sometimes, for example, people will want to, add encryption also to the payload, or add additional signing and signatures to the payload in addition to the transfer. And that's because it might be hopping through a couple of tiers on the back end, and they want to make sure it's secure all the way through. So, your mileage may vary in terms of the necessity for that. This comes back to what are our security controls? What is my application required to satisfy to meet the needs of what our business has decided is important? And some of that comes from compliance and standards, and some of that comes from the interpretation of those compliance standards, right? According to the customer. Integrity would be, again, the signature aspect, right? So making sure that your payloads are secure, making sure that data payloads can be, verified for integrity, so you're adding signature to those payloads as well. And that would include the discussion of token flow. When we talk about availability, that's really more around making sure, obviously, that some sort of, potential threat of denial of service, or potentially even just a peak period, doesn't take down your service. So this is where we get sometimes into the discussion of API management being useful, for example, because sometimes a gateway can be useful in offloading some of that distribution of overhead for requesting tokens and access, or from even just throttling, people that shouldn't be accessing. So depending on the usage patterns of your application, depending on how many people are potentially going to be accessing those APIs and what your ecosystem looks like, you may even look at, again, API gateways and management to help with the availability story. But in general, we're really just talking about making sure you can scale, making sure that your APIs don't have state, right? So they should be independent of state so that you can easily cluster them, that kind of thing, right? So just some basic fundamentals there. Now, another thing that I run into, again, before we get into token flow and discussion, is things around, what do those controls that I talked about with customers require in terms of protecting the back end? So when I have, data supporting my back end APIs, I have run into several circumstances where the requirement of the customer, because of their IT department and the controls that they require, says we can't allow any back-end APIs or any APIs that talk to data. Let me be more specific. They could also be in the cloud. They could also be on-prem, but they can never be facing directly to the internet. And so when you have that requirement, you're now looking at how do I architect my application to distribute the work so that anything talking to databases with sensitive information goes through an API layer. Did I just say SOA? Not really, but nobody wants to hear that word. But technically, this is what that requirement leads to, is the concept of a tier, right? The concept of another layer. And it's just something maybe to be aware of as part of the overall picture. So now, when we talk about the next layer that I want to get into is the API security and token flow. So that's the holistic sort of set of controls that you might think about. When we talk about token flow, we're talking about things like how do I authenticate the user if there is one, and then how do I call from JavaScript to APIs, how do I do mobile to APIs, how do I do web pages and APIs to backend APIs. We've got these tiers involved, we've got server processes calling APIs, we've got third-party APIs, and we've got possibly you sharing APIs to third parties. So there's a number of different use cases now that we can dig into just to sort of review in 15 minutes or less all of those details. So the holistic picture is what I'm trying to impress on you. If there's the one thing that you take away from this, is the holistic picture matters. Meaning, you know, there are lots of different ways to get a token and call an API. And maybe each API in your ecosystem could have been, you know, built by different departments or divisions or different developers. But at the end of the day, if you look at the system that you're building and where it fits in the picture of your enterprise and all of the moving parts, it's kind of important to take a step back and look at where am I getting these tokens from? How are we going to handle the authentication and authorization at the API tier? And probably the most important part, how do I make this easy for developers? And that's probably the thing that matters really the most, because what I find is conceptually this stuff is not that hard. And in practice, there are a lot of tools out here to do it. But it still requires knowledge of, you know, what does this picture look like architecturally, and what are the right ways or the choices and trade-offs when I'm making the calls to the different layers in my system. So if you just take a step back and look at that holistically, then you can think about things like, what kind of authorization server fits me best? Do I need more than one? Where are users authenticating, and what is the identity story? And are we using Active Directory? Do we have ADFS in place? Can all of the users come from there, and then we federate with some other authorization server to generate and issue tokens? So what does that look like? Taking a step back is just a really important beginning, I guess, to deciding how are we going to build this. And then the next step is, how do I standardize how I code it so that people just don't have to, you know, reinvent the wheel? And you know, I find over and over again that I'm implementing similar pieces of code that theoretically could have been a framework, but the reality is everyone wants this one little thing different and whatnot. And their permissions model is slightly different after we've done the authentication step. So you just kind of need to decide, what does it look like, and build some reusable things. So that's just a really important one message I would say to take away. Now on that note, let's talk about what are these flows that I'm talking about. So again, you know, we probably start with user authentication. So I'm going to start with probably OpenID Connect hybrid flow nowadays. In the old days, I said the old days, didn't I? It might have been WS Federation and SAML too. But now that we do have OpenID Connect and probably much better implemented across many of the different identity server stacks, the identity providers out there, it's much easier to just embrace this going forward, right? So that's what people are typically doing. So I've got this web app. I, you know, browse to it as a user. I'm redirected over to the OpenID Connect provider, or OP. I'm going to be, you know, probably presented with a login page if I haven't authenticated yet. I'm going to present my credentials over there. It's going to issue a token. And what that token looks like, you know, could vary. Theoretically, the spec doesn't say it has to be a JSON web token, but a JOT, but it usually is. And it also may or may not return an access token, but usually it does. So the JOT is really the proof of identity. This is the piece that says, you know, something about the user, possibly their claims. Those claims don't have to be permissions. They don't have to be roles, but they do have to be something that says, I know who you are, so that I can maybe go look up your roles and go look up your permissions in my system. The access token is what we would typically try to use when we call the APIs, because it's lighter weight. Nothing says you couldn't use the JOT, but it's lighter weight, it's smaller, and again, that could be another JOT, or it could be just a string, which is a reference to the fact that the user authenticated over at the server. Now, I make that point because it's important that you understand that the actual OP may do this slightly differently across the various applications that are available out there. Right? So when I'm talking about things like you know, cloud-based providers, Azure Active Directory, Auth0. Ping has a SaaS product. So SaaS products might do it slightly differently. You have on-premise products. Again, there are things like ADFS. There are things like Ping Identities Server. We've got open source products like Identity Server, IDS. So they follow the standards, but they might just have a slight different implementation of what exactly comes back. And it doesn't actually matter. And the reason it doesn't matter is because you own it. My application is co-located with that thing. I can handle the response to that and decide how I want to implement the rest of this architecture. It's still following the standard, and therefore I can still use those built-in APIs that come with ASP.NET or Node.js or other application platforms to make the request and get the response, and then I do something with that, which is usually going to be something like create a session. So now I've got a cookie, I've got a session, and okay, Captain Obvious, so now when I want to go from JavaScript to API, you know, I'm probably not going to use that cookie because, well, 500 other links I could send you to, why? It's not that you can't make that secure, but the mind share is, of course, not to do that because cores, because extra efforts you have to go into prevent form posts and things. You would use access tokens, okay. So how do I get the access token then? Well, I've just authenticated, I've come back, I've got an access token there, but there are some flows that allow you to, from a pure JavaScript application like a SPA, go and request your access token directly, which would do the same login dance. So potentially I could see this model where I go and do an OIDC implicit request, and I come back with an access token, and then I use that to hit the web API. I'll talk about the validation of the access token and that in a few minutes. But let's just say if I had already logged into the browser with that SPA application at that OP, then I would probably not see the login page, right? So now I have a session cookie as well. Now, the other thing that I could do is actually, instead of getting that back in a fragment, which would be for the SPA application scenario, I could actually have that posted back to the server, which means the access token is going to the server instead for the same flow. If I do that, then I somehow have to get that to the browser to call the API. So let's talk about that a little bit, because more and more, just working with customers, again, there's so many choices how you can do things. They don't want to deal with the client side negotiation, iframe refreshing, and all those types of things around the access token in the client JavaScript. So instead, what they're doing is saying, let's just render the access token over a secure channel, put it in the pages that need it. That access token still has to be validated when I call the API, so we'll get to that. But the point being, either way, I'm getting access to that token, and either way, I'm able to use it from JavaScript to make calls to APIs in my ecosystem. So that would look like this, right? I have access to the token, I make the call. So let's talk validation then. So most of these providers should all have a validation endpoint, which means I should be able to pass either the access token or a JOT and say, is this still valid? With access tokens, we will always want to call that at least the first time in this session in order to make sure that it is valid and maybe get some information back. I should be able to convert the access token to some user information, meaning the user has a session, this is their access token, what can I find out that is useful to me to possibly do authorization at the API? Does this user have the right roles or rights or whatever it is that they need in order to make that call? So I'm implying here that there should be some claims or information available to me somehow that I can do authorization. So when I call the validation endpoint, it's going to be a different endpoint depending on the server. So I've done this with various different application authorization servers. And the response back also could vary. Sometimes you can ask for it to give you back, say, user information. So that might be JSON with the user claims. Sometimes it can just give you back some basic information about the access. Sometimes it can just say, or it will just throw an exception, for example. So the point being, I'm checking if it's valid. Once I know if it's valid or not, I might opt to build into my own application some sort of cache so that I'm not hitting the application server every single JavaScript call. But then I have to put rules in place for things like how long should that cache? What is acceptable? What is the threat model for my application, for the scenario? Am I in a hospital lab where there's limited people, where maybe we have different rules than we would if we were out in the wild internet? So the threat model matters there. When we talk about validation then, the point is I'm checking it's valid, I possibly cache, that's up to me, and then I have a timeout for that I can make configurable at my application. So these are frameworks you build around this story, but when I said make it reusable, I meant that, right? So like, you know, you want to make sure that your developers find it easy to implement these no matter what platform you're on. So then what about third parties? If I'm in the JavaScript for my application, but we need to consume third parties, we have a couple of things we have to think about. One is who owns the API. If I don't own it, then I might have to, you know, succumb to whatever key material or whatnot that they require. And, you know, that might imply that there's some sort of shared secret, which is problematic, because now I've got key material that I need to somehow have access to, either from my JavaScript, bad, or I need to put a shim in place, which means an API behind my app that does the call for me to protect that material. So that's just another sort of consideration if you're calling third-party APIs that can't commingle with what you have as an authorization server. Another option could be, though, some form of hybrid implicit flow where you call the authorization server and ask for a token exchange where it goes and has the material necessary to go get the token for that API call. And then that would mean we're back to when that comes back, that access token from my server, whatever it is I need, I'm going to have to, you know, negotiate refreshing and whatnot. So that starts to get more complicated and also is not really part of the standard. It's more of a implementation to make your application work, which is part of the message, right? Now, when we talk about mobile apps, that implicit flow I already talked about is pretty much the same. I just wanted to capture that here, that, you know, you're basically using the same type of implicit flow for OAuth 2, where you're going to go and possibly get a refresh token, and if you do that, then you're using authorization code flow. Otherwise, you're going to be using the implicit flow and getting the access token directly to make the calls to your API. Same idea. So I'm going to move on. Two other scenarios from an architecture perspective that I run into as part of this holistic ecosystem. So I've talked about user login, and then I get a token, and then I have JavaScript, and I'm calling back, and I'm validating that token. And then I've got possibly server-side systems that maybe do asynchronous work or a Windows service type equivalent that needs to make a call to an API. So now I'm talking about client credential flow, which means I am a protected client. I'm not sharing that with, you know, the browser. I can have those, you know, client ID and secret secured within the context of my application configuration. I can safely make a call and get a token. But what that means is the APIs I call are doing what? They need to have a standard-based, you know, implementation for I'm always receiving an access token. I'm always validating it this way. I'm always caching it based on these rules. And then in terms of authorization, this app might not authorize based on user claims, but the APIs facing the web app are, because they know, which means that my authorization, you know, code, whether it's attributes on an API or some other thing, is going to know the difference because of the permissions I asked for. It's going to work because of that. But I'm trying to standardize so everything is always a token. And so that also applies then to this flow here, which is calling APIs on behalf of. So think about the web app or the web API facing the browser. User is interacting. User has logged in. I have an access token for that user. I know who they are. I have their claims. And now I need to call another API. Well, I could just pass, you know, access tokens around if their scope, so now we get into the scope of the actual token, allows it. But obviously, from a security perspective, what I want is the scope to be as limited as possible, but not so limited that it's unmanageable. So I usually ask customers to think about grouping their APIs at the front tier and at the back tier based on scopes so that you can somehow figure out, you know, which tokens are issued with what levels of scope. So I have an app ID for my, you know, web app and my web API, and it's allowed to call which backend APIs for what scope, X, Y, Z, or just X. And therefore, it will only be allowed to use the token in those places. Now, what I'm showing here is something that is still in progress from a specification perspective. So with some of the authorization servers I've worked with, I've had to use different endpoints to make this work. A delegation endpoint of sorts that I would pass in the access token that I have received from user authentication, for example, and request a token for the scope behind, so that I'm getting a new token that only has access to the scopes behind. And I'm calling it a custom grant here only because in one particular implementation, that's what we did, is we implemented a custom grant in order to validate the incoming token and its scope and who it's from, which means I'm passing in my material for the web app, and then get back from that an access token for the backend APIs that I'm requesting access to. And right now, again, there are ways to do this across the authorization servers that exist, but there is no approved standard yet. The standard is something that is in progress that looks a little bit like the WS Trust act as and on behalf of. So at some point, this will become more standardized. Now, why do I care if it's standardized if I can make it work today? I'll tell you why. Because I have one scenario where I'm building APIs for a customer to do all of these things I just talked to you about, and they actually have a hybrid scenario with an on-prem authorization server that is free, and then a cloud-based authorization server that is a different server. And now I need those frameworks so the developers are not confused to actually look the same to the developer, but do the right thing based on the authorization server on the back end. And that's not too hard to do, but it would be nicer if everything was standards-based. So obviously, we're heading in the direction where we're hoping that these things will be standards-based. Doesn't break the mold. It doesn't make it impossible to get the work done. But you want to look at this whole picture and look at all these scenarios and think to yourself, okay, do I have one authorization server? Do I have multiple? Do I have a hybrid situation? And what is the way to achieve the goals that I just listed to you? Which endpoints am I hitting to achieve that goal for those scenarios to build my application and actually finish the job? So how it happens might vary, but the theme is the same. Now, with API gateways, the only thing I would add is that if you are exposing your APIs to third parties and going through API gateways, there are many out there. There are SaaS products for this. There are also independent applications that you can install software-based. But at the end of the day, what you need to think about is how are the people consuming that? Do they need to commingle with your authorization and authentication story within your app ecosystem, or are these literally just other people that can authenticate however they need to identify themselves to access your APIs? So that may or may not need to commingle with your other story, but it's something to consider when you're looking at that in the holistic picture. So in summary, I guess, get that holistic view. Think about the different scenarios when you're building apps and what that means. Obviously, what I just talked about is the building of the apps and the various APIs that might exist just in your system. But now you've got to multiply that to how many systems in your org. There's going to be potentially different divisions and departments that are going to want to use the same methodologies, possibly the same authorization servers, maybe different development teams that could leverage the same code if you bring it all together in one story, which would be really helpful. That doesn't always work, by the way, because some people just can't make that happen, but we try. And just keep it as simple as possible for the devs by making the code reusable, including the authorization aspects post-token receipt. And I guess at the end of the day, hopefully that means you got this, because the baby says. Thank you. I'm done.
Nice work. Do we have any questions? Yeah. Here we go. Here.
So generally in the use case where you talk about the OAuth token exchange, which is really complicated back end, do you have any best practice recommendations in those areas? Because this is basically an area that I think many people, including myself, stepping into now, trying to figure out what to do.
Well, the question, if you're asking about token exchange specifically, are you referring to what I showed you? Because there's a lot of different types of token exchange, right?
Really
you're talking about tier-to-tier token exchange,
yes,
where you have an access token or a JOT, which is either an access token or even an ID token, and you want to get somewhere.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, if you're asking best practice, I mean, I think I mean, it depends on the authorization server that you're using, right? So I'm not really sure which aspect of best practices you're asking for, but I mean, the summary of that flow to me is, you know, you want to have access tokens that you can control the lifetime of, if possible.
Okay.
Not all servers let you do that, so
Yeah.
some of them will issue for 24 hours. You may not be able to withstand that with your threat model. You may want them to only live for an hour, but that also comes with the pain of users having to log in and identify themselves again, or the pain of refresh tokens, which is possibly worse because they live forever. They can be revoked. There's that. So one thing I didn't mention actually is that a lot of, many of the authorization servers I've worked with actually have access tokens that are really behaving like reference tokens. Okay. And what that means is if the user's blocked or invalidated, then the token doesn't work anymore. Not all servers do that though, so you want to look at that as well. Make sure that you can actually revoke them. And if you can't, then we get into the issue of the access token has to be shorter lived. And then you need the refresh token to go and get a new one, which again, refresh tokens work, but you know, now you've got another thing in the mix, which is complicated for most people. And then you've got to make sure that you have, you know, control over invalidation of those. So typically refresh tokens are used in the three-legged flows, okay, because that's where they make the most sense. Like, you know, forevermore, I've got applications that can post to my Twitter feed or Facebook, but if I ever go and check, you know, who I've granted that access, I can revoke it, right? Okay. So I don't know if I'm answering your question, but hopefully somewhere in there.
Yeah. Basically, if you really look at it, when you come to the refresh token flow, it becomes a little tricky. Like where is the correct implementation or policy for that?
So I try to avoid refresh token flow for the scenarios I showed you.
Okay.
Unless there's no other way. Because if the reference token is used by the authorization server, then I can actually get the same result that I need, which is I can get that thing invalidated. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
So do we have more questions? Oh, we got one at the back. Hello. Yep. Oh. There you go.
Okay, the question is more on the fine-grained authorization of API calls. Do you see the scope is sufficient to do this job, or do we need to consider XACML-based entitlement server to help with fine-grained authorization on those API calls?
So to me, scope is not a replacement for fine-grained authorization at all. Scope is just the validity and ability to use this token to actually even get past the front door or knock on the door. And so the authorization part after that is you know, dependent on the scenario, of course, right? If there's users involved, typically there's there's permission-based models, for example, fine-grained access controls around the user, around which assets they're allowed to access, and sometimes that goes as far as which rows in the database, right? So technically that's, my permission models usually use some form of attribute that's reusable that I can, you know, as much as possible automate with a resource action type of pairing. I know that's not XACML, so I'll get back to that, but you know, without XACML doing permission type models, then I'm actually possibly going against whatever permissions I've cached for myself, and I usually have line items. Each permission knows if it's allowed to be cached, and if not, then every time I need to ask for that permission, I hit the database for those special permissions that can't be cached. So you can build models around that with permissions. Now XACML, having been part of a business that built an XACML server, I would say is complicated, even for those that do it. But there are appliances out there that try to make that easier. I don't know that I would be implementing that in my code, though, only because I have rarely seen that successful.
Wow. Okay, thanks a lot. That helps.
Okay, so we are out of time. Just one thing, though. We have just a small point. If you are all API interested people, then you should know that there's another track going on. Pat Patterson, raise your hand. That's you. Yeah, I'm talking about you. So what time is your talk? 3:35. 3:35. And you're digging into Skim. So. Okay, good. So that being said, I want to say thank you so much to Michele, and please big.